go whenever you go.
Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. You never know when you're going to have one of these kind of brown bags, whether you're going to get a large number of people or just a small group. But
the audience knew outnumbers the speakers, so.
Yeah, there you go.
We're
We're doing okay. I think it was just, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwark. I'm the Director of Global Studies. I had a strong sense as I was watching television over the last couple of weeks that even though I may not be an expert on Egypt, which I am not, I do teach a course called the International Politics of the Middle East, that in fact this is a really important moment in a country that is really vital to the region and also very important, has been very important in terms of American foreign policy. And fortunately enough, we do have some other faculty in the history department who have indicated their willingness to join me and share a little bit, but mostly we hope that during the next hour or so there'll be an opportunity for back and forth discussion. I think we probably have as many questions as you do. You perhaps may have more answers than we do. But in any case, a general discussion about the ongoing situation in Egypt. Now, since I guess I'm the faculty member who's been here the longest and organized it, for those of you who don't know, on my far left is Kristi Barnwell, who is a new faculty member in the history department and a professor of modern Middle Eastern history. And then immediately to my left is David Bertaina, been here several years now, and also a professor in history dealing with comparative religions. And so my interest in the Middle East comes not only from the fact that I teach a general course, I'm really an international relations person, but that for the last 10 years or so I've been doing some work on Jimmy Carter and policies both towards the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and also towards the Iranian Revolution. We thought we'd start this out with Kristi talking a little bit about a historical perspective, and then, David, if you wouldn't mind going second, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about American foreign policy and how it relates to these sorts of things. So, Kristi, you want to?
Sure. So I didn't organize this into any sort of clear narrative or anything, but I thought that I would just give some general background information on constitutional development and constitutional tradition in Egypt in the 20th century, as sort of a little bit of background information, and then also a little bit of information about some of the economic problems in the second half of the 20th century under Nasser and then the subsequent presidents Sadat and Mubarak, and how that shifted towards the economic problems that are sort of in part at the heart of what's going on in Egypt today. So in terms of constitutional development, Egypt was an autonomous province under the Ottoman Empire at the end of the 19th century, and even as early as 1879 they had a constitution under sort of a semi-monarchical government. This constitution was essentially one that was very weak in terms of representation, but there had been constitutional movements throughout the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt was one of those that sort of took it up and ran one autonomously. The first constitution in 1879 and then the subsequent one in 1882 all gave most of the power to the head of the government, the Khedive, who later became the king. And then that king was able to dissolve parliament at will. There would be elections, but he could dissolve parliament anytime he liked and then hold new elections when he was ready to, in an effort to sort of restack the government. This was amplified in 1923. In 1922, Egypt gained limited independence from the British government. Britain sort of ran it as a protectorate after World War I, and then declared unilaterally that Egypt would be independent with some major caveats. They wouldn't have control over their foreign affairs, they wouldn't have control over expelling the British from Suez Canal, and so on. That being said, in 1923, after gaining their independence, they established yet another constitution. Again, this was a parliamentary constitution with an assembly that was elected. There was a nationalist party that was very active in Egypt calling for increased independence from the British government in particular. But again, the problem with the Constitution in 1923 was that the king was able to dissolve Parliament and then go ahead and reestablish Parliament as he liked. And also during this period, one of the problems with the Constitution was British interference. Because of this limited independence, Britain had set itself up that they could work closely with the king, back him on, or suggest that he dissolve Parliament and so on if policies didn't work for them. Okay, so this continued on through the 1920s into the 1950s. In 1952, there was a coup by junior officers who overthrew the monarchy, got rid of the monarchy, established an Arab republic, and then in 1953 established a new constitution that would have a representative assembly with 350 members. There were adjustments through this period in 1952 all the way into 1971. Okay, this is under Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser's leadership. There were adjustments because of Arab nationalism, associations with other countries in the region, and so on. But we do have, through 1952, the basic Egyptian constitution for a republic that continued to exist all the way until until 1971. Okay, in 1971, Gamal Abdel Nasser was assassinated. Died. Sadat took over. Okay, Sadat then established or sort of revised the constitution, made it permanent, again with the establishment of, this time, a two-party, or a two-house parliamentary system, one which is the People's Parliamentary, or the People's House, and then also the Ashura, or the upper level house. Okay. Again, the members of Parliament is something like 350 members. Early on in the 1960s, and then it changed a little bit, the representation. Early on, that representation was supposed to be, half of those seats would go to workers and peasants, and then 10 of those would be appointed by the president. But with this new Ashura Council, that's an appointed council. So there were adjustments that allowed for, in this new two-party or two-house system, that allowed for greater executive power over that legislative parliamentary system. And then in 1971, again, Sadat, when he took office, started these constitutional reforms. He appointed Mubarak, infamous Mubarak, as his vice president. And he has continued many of the policies that Sadat put in place from 1971. Sadat was assassinated in 1981, and then Mubarak took over and has been in power since then. Since that time, one of the biggest problems that's been in place in terms of the emergency, or in terms of the Constitution with Egypt, is that the rights that exist under the Constitution have been suspended by the amendments to the Constitution under Sadat and Mubarak that have allowed for emergency law to be put in place, and under Mubarak he has made for amendments to extend emergency law indefinitely. Just to give you a quick idea of what constitutional rights have been suspended as a consequence of this emergency law, they include restrictions on freedom of people to gather, restrictions on movement of people, arrest of suspects or people who pose a danger, arrest and search of people and places without restriction. They can require any person to perform any act. That's pretty vague and broad. The government can control communications, newspapers, publications, and all means of expression prior to publications, and they can seize and shut down places of printing. They can seize any property or impose security on companies and institutions. They can decommission weapons and ammunition, and they can evacuate entire regions or cut off transportation between areas. So this emergency law has, within the Constitution, has this ability to essentially suspend the Constitution or the rights of people under the Constitution. So that's been one of the main problems. So what we see in reference to sort of looking at the constitutional development is that Egypt does have a long-standing tradition of constitutional and participational government, but this has frequently been sort of adjusted, hijacked by people in power to sort of prevent the exercise of that and for sustaining their own positions in power. That was under Nasser to some extent, greater extent under Sadat, and then the entire duration of Mubarak's period as president. So we do have, one of the things is that we do have infrastructure for a democratic system of government, but there need to be, I would say, there need to be some revisions to prevent that from being so easily dissolved. And then quickly, without taking up too much more time, I just thought I would point out some of the economic problems that have taken place since the 60s, sort of 50s and 60s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I'll be very brief on this because I'm not an economic historian. Prior to Nasser's coming into power in the 1950s, there had been, one of the major complaints had been the concentration of wealth, this disparity of wealth that we're now beginning to see again in Egypt. That had been the concentration of land and means of production and so on in the hands of very few sort of upper echelons of business and in the hands of the royal family. So when Nasser and the junior officers overthrew the government in 1952, many of the policies that they put into place in the 1950s and 60s had been intended to correct that under the guise of Arab socialism. So this idea of redistribution of land, of spreading wealth around, providing educational opportunities to anybody who qualified to go to the university for free, and then the promise that graduates of the university would be given jobs in government positions and so on if they weren't able to find them elsewhere. So these were intended as corrections to the problems that had existed pre-Nasser. By the end of the 1950s and 60s, though, some of the problems that we see is that under Arab socialism, governments are not extremely efficient in terms of economic development. They frequently have a tendency to sort of get stuck on an idea, and as Egypt's bureaucracy would expand, they were less capable of adjusting their financial and sort of entrepreneurial plans. So that was one problem that came out, was stagnation of the economy. The other thing that we're continuing to see is that you get an increasingly educated population that expects jobs, but then there are jobs that don't exist. And so this was beginning to be a problem as early as the 1970s under this economic system that Nasser had put into place, this promise of getting government jobs and so on. When Sadat took power after Nasser's death, he began the infitah, or the opening of the economy, began liberalizing the economy, and to some extent this was successful. There were increased investments, there was an increased sense of entrepreneurial spirit in Egypt, but this was dampened by the fact that they had a whole lot to overcome because of the economic problems that had developed in the 1950s and 60s. So there was a sense that things weren't happening quickly enough. And then we did see the development, again, of this rising disparity of wealth under Sadat in this new free market or freer market system, as well as some degree of these licenses for businesses and so on going to members of Sadat's inner circle. And when Mubarak took power in 1981, this continued to take place on a greater level. There were some numbers listed today just to give you an idea of how this system of corruption has worked, and sort of cronyism and the thing that people are advocating against, are protesting. A number of, Al Jazeera listed a number of names of people, of billionaires in Egypt who happen to also have been leading members of the National Democratic Party, the single state party. Hisham Talat Mustafa owned a development group in Alexandria, was a billionaire, property developer, and a leading figure in politics in the National Democratic Party. His brother was also a member of the Ashura Council. His brother, also a billionaire, was the chair of the Housing Committee, I think owned something like, has $1.8 billion. Ahmed Al-Az has $3 billion in his wealth, and was a former secretary of the National Democratic Party. The former head of tourism was also a property developer, has $22 billion in wealth. Another housing authority, $1.8 billion in wealth. And so there's corruption closely tied to the regime. And so I've talked enough, and I'll leave that. I'll pass that on.
Thanks, Kristi.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the religious background to Egypt, and then how that is playing a role, or rather a non-role, in some of the events that are going on in Egypt right now. Of course, there are two main groups that make up the majority of the religious orientation in Egypt. The first one, going back furthest in history, is the Coptic tradition, the Coptic Christian tradition, which makes up probably around 8 to 10 million people in the nation. There are around 80 million people in Egypt today, so they make up around 10% of the population. So it's a not insignificant portion of the population that is Coptic. Of course, the Coptic Christian tradition began as early as the first century. You have some of the first places that Christian missionaries, apostles, went to was in northern Egypt, to Alexandria. It's one of the major cities, and so Coptic Christianity really begins to manifest itself in Egypt. By the 2nd century, we already had examples of Coptic writing, Coptic religious writing taking place, and so we see it gradually spreading from northern Egypt, or Lower Egypt, which is confusing for some people. Lower Egypt is northern Egypt, and of course Upper Egypt being the southern region. And so Coptic Christianity gradually spread all the way up the Nile to Upper Egypt, and down into what's present-day Sudan, which was the Nubia, and then continuing on into Ethiopia by the 4th century. So during the time prior to the 7th century, you see, Egypt was largely made up of Coptic Christians, and then Hellenophile people who were either many of either of Greek descent or local, and so there was very much an interaction between the pagan and Coptic Christians, and you can see some of that. The history of that is people have been really interested, especially in the story of Hypatia, who was a Greek mathematician. People have been interested in a lot of the story of the gangs and a lot of the gang fighting that took place in Alexandria during the late antique period. But with the rise of Islam, you have a radical change which takes place in terms of religious orientation. First, once in the period in which you have the Arab conquest or Islamic conquest is in the 630s, so pretty quickly afterward, after the death of Muhammad in 632. And by this point, you have a policy among the conquerors to allow autonomy in terms of administrative autonomy and religious autonomy, but at the same time, then there's imposition of certain taxes and so forth. So, which we don't have really. There's not really important for this right now. But what that leads to is that you don't have a conversion process starting in that, but over centuries, the culture gradually changes so that, especially in the 9th century, you have a shift over in which a Christian majority becomes a Muslim majority in the 9th to by the end of the 9th century. From the beginning to the end of the 9th century, Christianity moves. So notice that's about 200 years after the conquest. So it's actually a slow process which takes place. But that process took place mostly in Lower Egypt, in the north. So today Coptic Christians remained prominent, especially in southern Egypt. Especially if you look on the map, it would especially basically everything south of here, even in the Fayum region and southward. And the other place where they've historically been very strong is in Alexandria as well. And that's where the present Coptic Pope is, Pope Shenouda. And so Coptic Christianity has remained a significant minority within the country, or within the region of Egypt, through this time period. So in terms of what's going on today, where do the Copts sit with this? As I mentioned, they make up around 10% of the population. The present Pope Shenouda has actually called on non-action among Coptic Christians related to the protests. So he's not declared a specific opinion, but rather he said for Coptic Christians not to engage in any type of political activism, either for or against. So that's one of the interesting things to consider, is the fact that that while he's saying this, on the other hand, we have examples of Coptic Christians who are engaged in some of the protests. We have examples of images of Coptic Christians holding hands as a human shield while Muslims were praying in the square, protecting them from any potential violence that could happen to them while they were praying. We also have other examples the other way around, of Muslims holding hands around Christians while they were doing prayers. So there's been an interesting interaction between Coptic Christians and Egyptian Muslims during this protest. In terms of Islam, of course, Islam making up the Sunni Islam making up the large majority of present day Egypt, and out of that group, of course, the one that's most well known is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, gets its ideological origins especially from Sayyid Qutb, who was as a young student, spent the 1950s as a foreign exchange student here in the United States. And what he saw here with the prosperity and what was taking place here with the economic strength, when he returned to Egypt, that completely turned him off to American culture, and he became disillusioned with Western culture and with the Western economics. And his solution to the problem of materialism that he saw within American culture was to look for an alternative within Islam, within traditional Islam. And through Sayyid Qutb's writings and the disciples he was able to gather, there developed this movement known as the Muslim Brotherhood, which focused on a pan-Islamist doctrine of trying to reinstitute, specifically within Egypt, but also looking out, moving away from nationalist rhetoric towards pan-Arabism, towards pan-Islamism. So with Qutb and with the Muslim Brotherhood, you see a shift in political discourse in Egypt from this pan-Arab ethnic-based discourse towards one that's that is based more on religious discourse. The Muslim Brotherhood was basically feared and very powerful in one sense among the people, but also has never really exerted any type of power because of the policies of Nasser and Sadat and Mubarak, who have kept them under wraps, so to speak, both literally and figuratively. They've had people killed and imprisoned, and Qutb himself and was killed. So what we have historically from the Muslim Brotherhood is a role in trying to strengthen a distinctly Islamist community. They have been very interested in incorporating it in more of a constitutional government, like what we've seen in Iraq, where there would be the opportunity for multiple parties, but Islam is still the official religion of Egypt, and it would also require a Shura council, not unlike what you have in Iran, with a special religious council that advises the parliament, and it would call for a type of judiciary, executive, and legislative branches. But again, there's a special emphasis on the judiciary, and the judiciary would, of course, be especially trained within the traditional religious training of Al-Azhar, which is the most well-known university. So that has sort of been the political platform that the Muslim Brotherhood has put forth. What's interesting now with these protests is the Muslim Brotherhood has not had very much of an influence over the type of discourse that's happening right now. First of all, they were slow to get into the protests. They didn't encourage them initially, and so they were kind of caught flat-footed. It was only through the encouragement of some of the younger members, some of the people in their teens and 20s, that they should get involved, that it even started. And second of all, once the Muslim Brotherhood has gotten started, they haven't really taken over the type of protest and the message of the protest, which is pro-Egyptian and looking at improving improving the lives of Egyptians. So it's not using any type of specifically Islamic rhetoric or anti-Jewish, anti-Israel rhetoric. That isn't really taking place. And so a third factor with the Muslim Brotherhood is the fact that now they've been caught flat-footed again with entering into talks with Suleiman, the vice president. And then immediately there comes out a rejection by most of the protesters. No, we will not have talks with them. So the Muslim Brotherhood once again has been sort of caught, okay, wait, no, and now they've changed their minds and now distanced themselves from Suleiman in the last day. So the Muslim Brotherhood is the most powerful Islamist religious group within Egypt, is not been very much of an influential factor in terms of either instigating the protests, leading the protests, or even leading any type of talks that are going on. And so what's interesting about that is, I'll let you talk about foreign policy, but how does American foreign policy view that in terms of either potential fear or potential for a democratic Egypt, which leads up to your talk?
As I say, I want to offer a more foreign policy, international relations perspective based on some of the work that I've done, looking particularly at the Carter period, dealing with Egypt as a partner of Israel in the peace process, and then ask the question, which I think has been raised in a number of people, to what extent does this event compare to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which the Carter administration perhaps was its greatest foreign policy failure. I think the first point to note, sort of going along with Kristi's comment, is the dramatic difference that one sees between the Nasser regime and the Sadat's experience in power, which to me seems radically, is really significant. There's a Cold War context to this in which the United States, increasingly basically wants countries to choose either to support the United States or the Soviet Union. Nasser refuses to do that, and in that sense makes himself, at least to many Americans, a foe of the United States. So our relationship with Egypt becomes worse over time as our relationship with Israel strengthens. But I think the striking thing is Nasser was very much a supporter of the idea of Egypt being a leader of the Arab world, and this idea of pan-Arabism and so forth. And ultimately this led him to bring Egypt into a number of wars with Israel. And the thing that strikes me as most dramatic about this, in 1967, which was a disaster for Egypt, the so-called Six-Day War, Nasser offers his resignation after that conflict. And people come out into the streets and in support of him, don't resign. And so there seems to be, even though he had led the country into a disastrous conflict, much support. And then when Nasser dies in the early 1970s of a heart attack, again, the outpouring of grief, the images of people in the streets is really quite remarkable. So one has the sense that even though Nasser was one of those young colonels who took power in the early 1950s, I mean, one of the things that struck me over the commentary over the last couple of days is people talking about the fact that the military has run Egypt for the last 60 years. And I guess I just don't think of Nasser, even though he began power in a military coup, as having his power rooted in the army or the military. I see him as someone who obviously spoke a great deal and reflected much of the support. There was a lot of popular support for him in Egypt, whether he was legally elected or not, or whether the elections were fairly run. So when Sadat takes over, he's seen usually as a lightweight, somebody who's going to be in office for only a brief period of time, but he radically transforms Egypt's policies in two respects. After leading Egypt into another war with Israel in 1973, more successful but still not victorious, he uses that as a sort of springboard to reverse alliances and become basically America's best friend in the Middle East. And working with Henry Kissinger and then with Carter, as I say, and that's why, if you don't know, Egypt is today, I think, the second largest recipient of American foreign aid in the world, Israel being number one and Egypt being number two. And that leads to, obviously, Camp David Accords and the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979, so that Egypt becomes the first country to recognize Israel. And as a result of that, Egypt becomes ostracized, basically, in the Arab world. The Arab League, which used to be in Cairo, leaves, goes elsewhere in the Arab world. And the other thing that's striking, so in other words, what I guess most people observe is that Sadat's an Egyptian nationalist rather than a pan-Arabist in terms of the way that he sort of thinks about things. But here's another thing that's striking. As Kristi mentioned, in 1981, 2 years later, in fact it's a parade celebrating the 1973 war, Sadat is assassinated by what are usually called Islamic fundamentalists. And in the funeral that takes place after that, so this is 11 years after Nasser, instead of the great outpouring in the streets, it seems as if Sadat is mourned much more in other places than in Egypt. And Mubarak takes over for him and has largely carried out Sadat's policy, certainly towards Israel. You know, we note that over the last several years, as Hamas has established itself as a power base in Gaza, for example, I mean, the Egyptians have basically been enforcing the Israeli blockade of Gaza. And, you know, that's a really, you might ask yourself, why are they doing that? And presumably in part because of their connections to Israel and also because of pressure, perhaps, from the United States. So what I guess I'm suggesting is that Mubarak, following Sadat, has basically been America's best ally in this part of the world. He's been sort of the person who has been our local partner in terms of trying to encourage other countries to make peace with Israel, to follow the Egyptian lead. And then in terms of the Gulf War in 1990, Mubarak also played a kind of significant role. I mean, he was sort of Bush's interlocutor who went to see Saddam Hussein and said, you know, talked with Saddam, you know, about this conflict in Kuwait, and reported to Bush, oh, I don't think that, you know, Saddam tells me he's not going to invade, and so forth. And then subsequently, right, of course, yeah. Subsequently, you know, at a time when the United States was trying to not make that war a conflict between the U.S. and the Muslim world or the Arab world, Egypt became an important ally in the Persian Gulf area. So I say all of this in part because I think one of the real questions to ask now that has certainly gotten a lot of play is, what does this mean in terms of the future of, you know, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel? We have lots of other developments going on in Lebanon right now that I'm sure the Israelis find threatening, with the increasing power of Hezbollah. So all of these things are, you know, are I think incredibly important, and we don't know the answers, but we can understand why the questions are there. The second point, just to be real brief, is to comparisons between this situation and Iran. Similarities, I think the most obvious are that here's a situation in which we have two leaders who've been in power for a very long period of time, and probably were seen by American foreign policymakers as longevity equals stability. And, you know, that in effect, these are kind of impregnable, and so we tended to ignore the warning signs or the danger signs that there were, in fact, serious rumblings and discontent. I've heard the comments made again, intelligence failure, where there are problems to see sort of things going on behind the scenes. One of the things that seems dramatically different to me is that the situation in Iran developed over a whole year. That, in other words, from the beginning of 1978 until the end of 1978, there were demonstrations and you know, major series of problems. This situation seems to have developed relatively quickly. I really haven't heard anything other than what's happened in Tunisia. So in other words, I guess I'd be interested either if any of you know, or if any of you know, if there's some kind of spark here, or whether we're talking about a situation where people just said they've had enough, you know, that the situation reached a kind of turning point. And I mean, obviously David has said something very important, because the role of religion in Iran was so significant, both at the time and obviously in retrospect, Iran is, of course, a Shia country, not a Sunni country. Whether that means more in terms of political activism. There were other groups, obviously, than the Ayatollah Khomeini's group that were involved in the Iranian Revolution. But obviously, they ultimately were the ones who led the triumph and the overthrow. I guess the last point that I'll make here is that, I mean, the Carter administration really mishandled the situation in Iran. I mean, they for 10 months, they didn't give it the kind of proper attention that in retrospect it's easy to see they should have been. It didn't arise to the top of the policy agenda until November 1978 when the choices were, there were no good choices left. And the striking thing is there's a big debate in the Carter administration between the national security advisors, Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Brzezinski says, first we've got to support the Shah at all costs, and then if the Shah isn't able to hold on to power, we should support a military coup. And so there's, you know, strong reliance on the army, strong sense that the army will be a source of stability and source of support for its connection with the United States. You find State Department people basically saying the Iranian military is a weak reed on which to rest, and that increasingly we see desertions from the Iranian military, people joining the demonstrators, and so forth and so on. And I think one of the real questions, obviously, to be looked at in this context is precisely the same question. The role of the Egyptian military. Obviously, there are lots of connections between the U.S. military and the Egyptian military. I heard Robert Gates speak yesterday talking about, you know, the fact that the Egyptian military was playing an important and professional role. But I think, you know, you have to ask yourself, you know, what role are they going to play? Are they going to be basically supportive of Mubarak or others continuing to hold on to power, at least for a period of time? Or at some point, are they going to, you know, basically be forced to choose? And will, in fact, at that point, they act as a unitary force? Or will, you know, will there be a division within the military? But those are the sorts of things that I think, you know, are useful questions, at least, to ask based on the work that I've done in the earlier period. So, I don't know if anybody has anything to react to each other, or if you folks want to make comments, because I think we said at the very beginning, you know, we've all been observing this and so forth. So if you have questions or comments or observations.
I have a question for probably David, I guess. Because you were talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. I was listening to NPR last night on the way home, and they had a story that mentioned that Hamas came out, was a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they didn't go into any specifics, so I didn't know if there was actually any real connection there, or if it was just a...
The Muslim Brotherhood has, Hamas, there were interactions through pan-Islamic interests, but the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas have gone in different directions. The Muslim Brotherhood now professes itself as nonviolent. I think Zawahiri, who was was a former member of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Egyptian who's the number 2 in Al Qaeda, but found the softening and the nonviolent stances not progressive enough and actually left for Al Qaeda. So so there have been shifting towards a rejection of any type of violence in the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a little bit different from some of the earlier. It's less aggressive than it was perhaps in the 50s and 60s as well. So I think that connection might have been there in its origins, but now they're much more different. Hamas, because it's so closely connected with the Palestinian cause, and the Muslim Brotherhood is located specifically in Egypt, and with Egyptian concerns, they have their own concerns now.
Yeah, that would be one thing. Muslim Brotherhood has branches, or had, when it was largely a pan-Islamic movement, had these branches set up throughout the Arab region. But over time, with the failure of pan-Arabism and this pan-ishness, there's been the connection has been more locally related. So the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan is much more a Jordanian organization. Hamas is very much a Gaza and Palestine issue. Hezbollah is very much a political Islamic movement in Lebanon. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is really interested. They're interested in local, national issues, more so than regional kinds of connections.
Yeah, Barbara.
Does anybody have any kind of a handle or helpful thoughts on the balance between the economic frustration, which seems clearly to be fueling some of this, and political frustrations with the restrictions on meeting and forming parties, and I mean, how much of this is just economic frustration,
Right.
which could be satisfied by a whole wide range of changes that didn't really change very much, and how much of it is really a movement toward a different kind of politics and social organization? Or is there any way to know?
One theory is that it comes out of the economic thing. When you have the blowing up with the recession, you have the blowing up of the housing bubble, and people begin to throw their money into bonds. People begin to throw their money into safe staples, which are commodities. With all of this, and the run-up in prices results in higher food prices. And because you have, because of other factors with weather and so forth, the higher food prices lead to, especially in Egypt, in places where you don't have enough money, where you can't just walk into a Whole Foods and decide between a million different options. This is a big deal. And so the food price run-up caused by economic global recession leads to more of the economic dissatisfaction, which leads to a fruit peddler in Tunisia committing self-immolation, which leads to unrest across several other countries in the Middle East. So there's one economic argument for it. I don't know.
I'll just add that those two, I think in the minds of many Egyptians, those two things are inextricably linked.
I would agree, yeah.
For example, again, this Al Jazeera's video this morning was fantastic, and they articulated it very well. This problem that
You must be glued to your computer,
I
because
kind of have
Al
been.
Jazeera on television.
I have. They stream it, but they also have videos on the internet of this piece that they did. But one of the things that they were pointing out is that this corruption of people with billions of dollars in the National Democratic Party at the top impacts corruption all the way down to the lower levels, so that civil servants who are lucky enough to get a job out of the university are making these piddly salaries that they can hardly live off of. And the only way that they can sort of make that up is through corruption, through bribes, through sort of creating this black market of paperwork and black market of bureaucracy, so that you can't get any official document signed unless you're willing to pay out a little bit of extra money. So the idea is that this economic situation is so endemic to the political system that exists, and as long as there's no representation, there's no way for anybody to sort of express dissatisfaction and come up with solutions. So I would say that it's inextricably linked. It's been made worse, certainly, by the economic recessions and the unavailability of bread, but yeah.
I just wanted to add the youth factor, which is not just playing in this country, and it's playing in lots of places, and the fact that such a tremendous percentage of the population, and I couldn't, unfortunately, the CIA World Factbook doesn't provide it well, they said 33% of the population is under the age of 14, but there's a huge percentage of the population, maybe like 50%, that's under the age of 25.
The New York Times had an op-ed piece that showed that for yesterday, I think, or it may have been Monday or Tuesday.
But
and all throughout the Middle East.
Throughout the Middle East, this is true, that you've got this baby boom that has occurred in lots of developing places. And the theories that demographers have been throwing around is that when you have a tremendous number of young people who do not then have jobs, but also may have access to education, so they don't have jobs, there are a huge number of them, I mean, just raw numbers, and they have now access to education and access to technology that tells them about other opportunities in the world. And it seems like it partly explains what happened in Tunisia, may partly explain what's happening here. It's certainly one of the factors that occurred in Iran, and its problems last year. At any rate, I think that's something that needs to be thought about. And again, thinking about it, there's a unique case of Iraq and Iran, or Iran and Egypt, but what does that mean in other places? The other interesting thing about that whole idea of having a huge baby boom is that other demographers have said this is a demographic dividend. This is a good thing. And India has been able to play that out. Both Egypt and India have this huge growth, but they've also had a fall off in birth rates, meaning that you've got, the future is getting better. In other words, you've got fewer babies being born, and you've got this huge number of people who could have jobs. And India seems to be playing that well, that here's an opportunity for investment to take a population that's getting better and better educated and give them an opportunity to participate in the economy. And that would appear is not happening here. So this is a group, this is either a good thing, it's either a dividend or it's a matchstick.
And let me just sort of follow up with that. I mean, the other thing that is, I think, striking about this is that, as Kristi was saying, you know, under Sadat, you had a kind of opening up of the economy, at least a little bit. And to some extent, that produced some very serious problems. There were big food riots in Egypt in 1977, and I think probably prices went up dramatically, and maybe that's what you're, you know, sort of talking about as well. But I taught this course on the international relations of the Middle East a couple of years ago, and I used a book on globalization. And one of the things that's striking about this part of the world is how little globalization has affected it. And in other words, compared to many other parts of the world, it's heavy government control and so forth. And what you have tended to get is basically what I would call crony capitalism. And I mean, it's not, it doesn't just happen in Egypt, but it relates to the corruption that you're talking about. So in other words, you know, large parts of the economy are still heavily protected. They're done that. They're done in a way, they think, because they think this will, I suppose, make sure that there are more jobs, but it also, of course, cuts out other possibilities for growth and so forth. But those people who secure those licenses, who secure those other kinds of things, almost always have connections to the government, almost always have connections to the regime. And I'll just make one other point, which I had not heard about until, if you watch CNN or, you know, maybe if you watch other, but anyway, Fareed Zakaria is a frequent commentator these days to these things. And Zakaria made the comment both in print in Time magazine and then when he was interviewed on CNN the other day. And I had not realized this, but apparently Mubarak's son Gamal, who is Western educated and who is generally thought was being groomed as the successor, is now sort of being, you know, is not going to be the successor, we presume. But at any rate, according to Zakaria, encouraged the development of some reforms. And he said part of it was also because the IMF was insisting on some of these things. So I think the date that he talked about was 2006. But he said you actually see a jump in the Egyptian economy of like 6 to 8% over, you know, a couple of years. And then I would guess we have the recession effects here. So what's particularly striking about this situation, and he made the Tocqueville kind of argument, you know, well, there are two elements. One is the notion of rising expectations. People see things getting a little bit better, and then things go down. But also the argument, which Hillary has heard me make in our class on Russia, you know, one of the most difficult times for a corrupt government is when it tries to clean up its act a little bit. And maybe there isn't very much evidence that this government's been trying to clean up its act a little bit, but Zakaria was making the point that this process of opening was, in fact, a little bit of a reform process. And the thing, of course, and he also was making the point, with a lot of talk about social media, that even though under the emergency provisions, and obviously the government's been trying to crack down, but that Twitter and Facebook and a variety of other sorts of things have become much more accessible. So in general, his argument was that those factors, together with this period of economic growth, raised people's expectations in a way that apparently, you know, subsequently got dashed and have been dashed. But I think corruption is the thing that brings these elements together in a very powerful way.
And a corner, and then we'll get you.
Go ahead.
has fluidity, and has stability, and a believer in power. Query. From now until 6 months from now, and from 6 months from now until a year from now, what will happen? No. You can establish, you all know enough to establish where the possible centers of power are. Some will win, some will lose. What are your best guesses? Now to 6 months, 6 months, 12 to 12 months.
It's complicated, there are a whole lot of things that.
Of course it's complicated.
Yes, there are a whole lot of things, I mean, technically, it's complicated in terms of the next couple of weeks, what's gonna happen, because we need Mubarak to leave. Mubarak has to sign over power to Suleiman, who can then lift emergency law and then make it possible for elections to happen. Now, we know one thing is that the National Democratic Party cannot participate in the elections, in large part because all of their high-up officials resigned this week, okay? And as a consequence of their resigning, they can't immediately join another political party, and so they won't be able to run in government in the next elections. The next elections will have to take place within 60 days of Omar Suleiman lifting emergency law. Okay, so there's some technical things that have to happen. One thing that we do know is that the National Democratic Party cannot legally take over and participate in the elections because all of the bigwigs have resigned. So they won't be able to do anything, fortunately, under the way that the laws are structured. There are political parties in Egypt that have some level of organization, but for a variety of reasons, they haven't been able to register their parties for elections. You know, Mubarak and his cronies have been excellent masters of bureaucracy in terms of keeping almost everybody out of the elections, which is why, I mean, Muslim Brotherhood is illegal within Egypt, but another party, Al-Ghad, has, which translates to tomorrow, has had success in actually getting on the ballot. They weren't able to win because the elections were completely fraudulent, and then Ayman Noor, the leader of that group, was actually arrested and detained for a number of years. But they managed in the last election to get something like 7% of the vote. And then we have Mohammed al-Baradei, who has come in and is not necessarily part of any specific party, but you know, has been extremely popular among the leadership. Now, what's going to happen in the next couple of months is going to be some sort of transitional government that will have to be put together. And I think that whatever this transitional government that's put together will give us a better sense of what's going to happen in the post-6 month period. But Omar Suleiman has already demonstrated his intransigence, I think. He was supposed to meet with everybody, with a bunch of different leaders, and he immediately sort of panned all of these meetings in an attempt to meet with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is sort of a tactic that they've been using for a long time in terms of divide and rule. So part of this factor is whether or not the United States is going to stand behind Omar Suleiman as a figure to lead the transitional government. And I think a lot hinges on you know, U.S. support for or sort of struggle with Omar Suleiman and what he can do. And he's also crucial in this military element because he's been head of security forces. He is sort of this underground guy in the dungeons torturing people for the last 30 years. And so, maybe not so underground, but so he is closely linked to the security forces and closely linked to the army. And the army has been, it seems, a lot less active in the political process, but certainly the internal security forces have been involved. So it all, I think, depends on what happens with Omar Suleiman and whether or not he's able to stay in power.
So you're saying power depends on three things, some combination. Power always depends on some combination of information, money, and its surrogates on force.
Yeah.
And what you're telling me is that in the end, it is the guys with the guns who will win.
I didn't say that.
That's what
I didn't quite say that because there's the money element, the United States money element as well in there. And the extent to which this protest can hang on and, you know, make it clear that Suleiman can't hold power for, you know, that they're not going to accept that.
Do the other two agree with
Well,
that?
I think, it's interesting. Actually, you know a lot more about the opposition than I do. And that again reflects that I'm a kind of, IR person, and my approach to the region is primarily through foreign policy. But I think, one of the things that strikes me is what happened in, I'm going to take another example, which is Iran in 2009. Now, maybe that situation is not entirely comparable, but what that shows us, I think, is that if you have a really determined government, and even though you have lots of people in the streets who feel that their vote has been stolen from them, and whether it's a question, it really goes to your point of, are people prepared to really fight this out over a long period of time? And as you say also, I think you're right, I think the American position is going to be pretty important. And obviously, we had no leverage in Iran, and potentially we have some significant leverage. I think, we ought, it's interesting, I heard Obama say that President Mubarak should think about his historical legacy. And certainly one element of this is, and you can see that Mubarak's back has kind of gotten up, right? He doesn't want to be forced from power. So, if you're thinking about, again, historical analogies, if he needs a golden parachute, we know he's got tons of money, but, are there things that can be done that can make living wherever he would be more attractive, than where he currently is?
I would add, and then we should probably move on to Hillary. I would add that in terms of the guns, there are two groups within Egypt that have the guns, right? You've got the security forces and you've got the army. And the security forces are essentially an extension of the government. Those are mainly there for internal security monitoring. These guys are sort of the spy network for the government and are much more closely linked and dependent on the government. The army...
Those are the ones who've been,
yes,
last
who have
week
been in
were
charge
going
of
into the square.
Yes, these mobs and so on that were causing violence, allegedly. There's plenty of evidence demonstrating that that's what was going on, but the extent to which it was real supporters versus...
Well, you're not Hillary Clinton, so you can say it.
Yes, yeah, it has. I've seen pictures of the IDs saying that that's what's going on, but the extent to which all of them are, or versus some of them are, or whatever. So we've got the security force on one hand, which is what Suleiman himself is closely linked to. And then we've got the army, which has been sort of a non-actor in this, and to their benefit in the beginning, and now to their sort of detriment in terms of reputation. But the army itself is made up of Egyptians. It's made up of these very people who suffer under the government. And, everybody out in Tahrir Square has a cousin, a brother, or somebody who's in the army. All right, and so what we saw in the first few weeks was that the army itself and the relationship between the army and the people was very closely knit. People were bringing food out to the soldiers, they were hugging and kissing the soldiers, they're standing on tanks next to soldiers, and things were sort of very congenial. And the army has sort of been serving as a sort of protection or a protective barrier between the armed thugs and the protesters in Tahrir Square. There have been movements where the army has sort of let things mix and get out of hand, but then they've gone back to sort of maintaining some semblance of separation. And it's hard for us to tell whether or not this is general sentiment within the army or if this is orders that they're getting from higher up. But the army is still a big question mark in whether or not they're going to go for Suleiman or if they're going to go for the protesters. And who they'll back after that is still, we're still not sure.
I just wondered what percentage, that percentage of the population that is not been actively participating in these as protesters on the square, or even some of those, that how long can they last without income? In other words, if the economy has truly been brought to a standstill, which is what the argument has been made, particularly from tourism, and tourism is really a big part of that, at least for some people, and particularly probably for the bigger cities than in other places. At some point, pressure is going to come from that population against the protesters to talk or to bargain or negotiate in ways that at least some of the protesters won't want to do. So.
There were widespread strikes that just started today. So there are even new groups that are not protesting but now engaging in strikes, like in Suez. I noticed that just started today, so.
There have been complaints, though. There have been, from the bourgeois, from the middle class, the upper middle class, has started to complain about the fact that their shops aren't doing well, that they just want to get back to regular life of going to the coffee shops and going to visit their friends and sort of doing the regular thing. There are fishermen, I've seen videos, interviews with fishermen who are complaining about the fact that this is interrupting their daily lives. And part of that is that they hadn't been getting outside information about what's going on and what was causing this slowdown. Okay, so they had been getting a lot of news from Nile TV and other state-run publications that were saying that, you know, these protests are small and they're not really widespread, and not really sort of giving any real information about what was going on. As that information barrier has been broken, and particularly Mubarak has sort of cut his own nose despite his face. I mean, it's been kind of ridiculous, but he got up there and said, I'm in favor of reform, and this was all over Nile TV and so on, the state media, and then the next day sent out forces and attacked the people in the square. And once that got out, people who were originally believing what Mubarak was saying have since sort of said, you know, okay, this is more of the same, this reform stuff is not going to happen. So there are elements of society who are sort of complaining and are getting upset with the way that things have interrupted daily life. But as more information comes out, we are seeing more and more people going into the square and participating in various cities. So it's hard to say, I mean, it's hard to say how long they'll be able to keep it up. But for now, the momentum is not being lost, it doesn't look like.
And you can see how, from Mubarak and Suleiman's perspective, it's kind of waited out.
Right,
Exactly.
yeah, and hoping that that will divide the protesters, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for organizing this, Steve.
Thank you.
Very
Good job.
useful to
Yeah.